Good afternoon, and thank you so much for joining us for this author talk. It is just one part of the Atlanta History Center's virtual Martin Luther King Jr. Day annual virtual offerings, although this year there is a wealth of material and educational resources on Dr. King available online due to the pandemic. I'm Virginia Prescott from GPB, thrilled to be hosting this conversation with Charles Black and the Reverend Dr. Otis Moss, two friends and colleagues of Dr. King, and Paul Kendrick and the Reverend Stephen Kendrick, here with us to talk about a little known but extremely consequential event in the life of Dr. King, and as we will learn, in the decades of American politics that followed. Before the march from Selma to Montgomery, before the I Have a Dream speech in Washington, and before the letter from the Birmingham jail, Dr. King was sentenced to 4 months of hard labor by a DeKalb County judge stemming from a traffic violation. 9 Days, The Race to Save Martin Luther King Jr. and Win the 1960 Election is a new book by Paul and Stephen Kendrick, which details the people and the political maneuverings that aligned to free Dr. King and at the same time encouraged the Black vote, voter support for John Kennedy in the triumph over Richard Nixon in the closest presidential election of the 20th century. You can purchase the book directly from Acapella Books. There's a link at the chat to the right of your screen. There's also a link at the Atlanta History Center website. Charles Black is showing us the book right now. It looks great.
Oop, there it is.
And as we're talking, please do submit your questions using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. I'm going to try and integrate as many of them as possible as time allows. It could take a long time to list the accomplishments of our distinguished panel, so I'm going to condense. Please forgive me for anything that I miss. The Reverend Dr. Otis Moss Jr. is a theologian, a pastor, and a Morehouse graduate. He's recognized as one of America's most influential religious leaders and a hero of the civil rights movement. He served as regional director of Dr. King's Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or SCLC, and we should add a Georgia native. Welcome to you, sir.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for being here. Mr. Charles Black, he is also a Morehouse alum, where he was one of only 8 students taught by Dr. King. As chair of the Atlanta student movement, he earned the nickname Charles Sit Down Black for direct action protests to desegregate Atlanta businesses and for voting rights. He continues to inspire student activism and just maybe the only person on our panel today to be called an OG by Killer Mike. Thank you so much for being with us, Charles Black.
My pleasure.
Paul Kendrick is a leader, speaker, and writer whose articles have appeared in a range of publications, from the New York Times to the Washington Post to Talking Points Memo. Paul recruited and developed talent for the Obama White House and is now an adjunct professor at National Louis University in Chicago. 9 Days is his third book, co-authored with his father. And Paul, welcome to you.
An honor to be here. Thank you so much, Virginia.
Reverend Stephen Kendrick is senior minister of First Church Boston. It's a Unitarian Universalist church. He's published a novel, an illustrated YA book, and 3 history books with his son, Paul: Sarah's Long Walk, Douglas and Lincoln, and now 9 Days. Stephen, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you very much, Virginia. We're looking forward to celebrating Martin Luther King Day with these auspicious guests. Paul and I feel so lucky that they contributed to our knowledge, and now they can help tell this story. We're so pleased that they're with us today.
Well, I am so pleased to talk with all of you about this story. And there's so much to tell here. But first, Reverend Dr. Moss, since you knew Dr. King, I'm wondering how you like to celebrate the Martin Luther King Jr. holiday.
Well, in many ways, one through trying to tell the story of his impact on our lives, the movement, American and world history. Two, trying to communicate that it is not a holiday in the traditional sense. It is a call to duty, to action, to commitment, recommitment, and a lifting up of accomplishments, and yet giving a mirror of what has to be done, what has not been done, and all of the challenges, the agonies that we face at this very hour. So it's a learning from the life of Dr. King. It's being motivated by the works and also being challenged to get involved, deeply involved, recommit ourselves, and also to pass on to the next generation as best we can the beauties, the challenge, the commitment, as well as some of the pain, the ugliness that they must grapple with as well.
Well, thank you for being part of that service for all of us here today. How about you, Charles Black? You are one of few students taught by Dr. King at Morehouse. I'd love to hear what you're reflecting on this day.
Well, I'm always thinking back to moments when I was in King's company or matters that centered around him. I was pleased that he called me Brother Black. There's other students in the class he addressed as Mr. or Miss, so he called me Brother Black. But I think of moments when, like when the Birmingham church was bombed, and I rushed over there the next day and was at the press conference with King about that bombing. I think about things that he liked to do, like eat ribs from Alex Barbecue. And time he spent at B.B. Beeman's on Auburn Avenue and at Pascal's on Hunter Street, now named for him, Martin Luther King. I reflect on the day of his funeral when I was the lead marshal for the funeral procession. Lonnie King and I had organized about 1,000 marshals that be stationed all the way between the Morehouse campus and Ebenezer Baptist Church, 4 on each corner to control traffic. And I in my car would ride ahead and notify them that the procession was on the way and the like. So it's that kind of thing that I reflect on. I think about one day in his class when we were discussing Plato and Socrates' philosopher king concept, and he and I had a little tete-a-tete about that. They held that people were suited for different kinds of pursuits in life. Some as craftsmen, some as soldiers, and others as philosophers. And that they thought that, and the philosophers in those days were a combination of the wise men and scientists, and they were the smart people. And they held that only philosophers should rule. And I took the position, I thought that was a good idea, that you shouldn't have stupid people in charge. And King argued, of course, about democracy and one man, one vote, and everybody having a chance to participate in the democratic process and all that. And I've often said that if he'd been around today, he would agree with me and Plato and Socrates that you should put dumb people in charge. But anyhow, that's part of the reflection that I do when a day like this comes around. And I also remember the first King Day when they had a parade, as we call it, I guess, a march. And my granddaughter, who's now 36, 37 years old or so, was just a little kid, and she got tired walking, and I put her up on my shoulders and marched in that very first King March after his death. And I have to let you in on another little secret that the first King Bazaar or Gala, I think that they had, was at the Omni in downtown Atlanta, and I was there with my wife, and I was backstage there somehow with Coretta and Harry Belafonte, Lena Horne, Rosa Parks, my wife and I, and we were kind of in a circle, and my wife was going crazy over Harry Belafonte, and I'm going crazy over Lena Horne, and we all have champagne glasses in our hands. And while she is going goo-goo eyes over Harry Belafonte, she bumped my arm, and my champagne went all over Rosa Parks' blue gown.
Oh my!
And she was not amused, and I kind of disappeared back into the crowd a little bit.
Well, who could blame your wife, and who could blame Rosa Parks for not being amused?
You know, many years later, I ended up playing her grandfather in the Rosa Parks story on CBS. And I've told folk that if Rosa Parks had been around, she would have vetoed that. If I spilled all that champagne over a beautiful blue
Well, you know, we actually have a question from the audience already about that. Maynard wants to know how you transitioned from civil rights activist to celebrated actor, or if you effectively combine the two.
Well, it's the same thing. It's a form of activism. I get an opportunity to play folk that I ain't. That's what actors like to do, especially if it's a bad guy, you know, or a woebegone kind of a person, so you can look bad and get dirty and all that. We like to do that sort of thing. But I found many opportunities to convey some serious messages through my acting experience. And I've been in 100 and some different projects, movies, TV series, and the like. So I find it somewhat of an extension, but I'm also very much involved in activism continually. I chair the board of Freedom University, which assists undocumented students to prepare for and get into great institutions, in some cases, free rides at Ivy League institutions. And I chair the board of an international adoption agency where we get permanent homes for kids from Ethiopia and India and other places, you know, South America and the like. All of which I see as something of an extension of activism.
Well, let's get to this book, because there's an activist in this book, many of them, but one that comes across in such a bold way. The book is about the 9 days of the incarceration in 1960 of Dr. King that often is eclipsed by other monumental events in his life. And also there have been a lot of previous tellings that have been put the focus on the political fallout for the 1960 election and the Kennedys specifically at the center. But there's a lot of moving parts here. And as we dig in, Lonnie King, the leader of the Atlanta student movement, was absolutely instrumental in this. Reverend Moss, you worked with him. How would you describe him? You both worked with him, but I'll go to you first, Reverend Moss.
Lonnie King was a phenomenal person, quick in movement and action. That's something that probably a lot of people do not know. Lonnie King was, at the time of the movement, a full-time student, full-time employee with the United States Post Office, and a full-time husband, and a full-time chair of the Committee on Appeal for Human Rights, the student sit-in movement of Atlanta. Now, if you think of those 4 phenomenal assignments and commitments, and yet somehow he was able to function and manage responsibly in each one of those categories. A full-time student, full-time employee with the United States Post Office, a husband, and the leader of the Atlanta student movement. And with those 4 magnificent, tremendous responsibilities, he seemed to give full energy and inspiration to each assignment. I shudder to think, when did he sleep? Charles, you might want to.
I don't think he did.
When did he sleep? When did he eat? And yet he was the most energetic, ready to move, ready to act person in the movement. And he was not just an activist of presence and energy. He was an activist leader in the movement. He had some advantages. He had grown up in the Ebenezer Baptist Church He had known Daddy King, Dr. Martin Luther King Sr., from childhood. He had known Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. from childhood. And that marvelous generation of seniors, senior leaders in the African American community he had met through his association with the Butler Street YMCA. So he brought all of these experiences and qualities and contacts to the leadership of the Atlanta student movement. And I think, and this might be a selfish thought, that this made the Atlanta movement unique. There were some other factors that made it unique, but we had a chair who now, and I should also mention that he had done military service in the United States Navy, where he deliberately entered the military service in order to finance his college education because he felt that burden was too much for his mother. And that was the path he took to further his higher education. Those are just a few of the things that we can say about our friend and brother, the late Lonnie King. And I'm sure Charles can add a few things here.
Well, let me interject, if you don't mind, for a second, because the story that I understand, I think it's repeated in the book, is that he heard about the Greensboro lunch counter sit-ins, and he decided, like, let's just do it. Let's make this happen, and kind of started the Atlanta student movement there with Julian Bond. But he was a man of action and following through on that energy. But this was also a very strategic movement, that they had students on a considered day, on the day that he asked Dr. King to come and participate in this lunch counter sit-in in Atlanta at Rich's department store. There were students fanned out all over Atlanta. They had walkie-talkies. They organized rides to get there. They had checkpoints. It was a very strategic thing. But he asked Dr. King to join the sit-in at Rich's, knowing that they would get arrested. Charles Black, what was the ultimate goal there?
Well, our movement had started with the publication of a document called An Appeal for Human Rights back in February of 1960 that appeared as a full-page ad in the Atlanta Journal and the Atlanta Constitution, when they were separate papers, and was picked up by the New York Times and run free of charge as a full-page ad. It was also run in the Atlanta Daily World here in Atlanta, black paper. And our first sit-in was on March 15th of that year. So we're in October now. You know, this sit-in that King was involved with was October the 19th. Mm-hmm. So our movement had been going on for a good while and was frankly losing some steam. You know, folk were wanting to go back to those stores and buy stuff. And they were kind of eager to have this thing over. And we needed a spark for the continuity of our movement. And we were also aware that it was 2 weeks from election time for President of the United States. So this was all very intentional. For background purposes, it's important to understand that Dr. King had not been involved in any of the civil rights activity in Atlanta during this time, at the request of his father and the established black leadership. Mm-hmm. Their attitude essentially was, you know, we got this, you know, we don't need Junior here leading us. And he'd agreed to that. And so that it was after he'd been arrested for driving a car with a Georgia license plate, and he still had his Alabama driver's license. Mm-hmm. The reason he was stopped, however, was because there was a white woman in the front seat with him. Coretta was in the back seat. The white woman was Lillian Smith, the great author. And that's why he was stopped. And this was the pretext for his arrest about the driver's license. So he was, the sentence that he was given was probated. I was in the courtroom when he was sentenced. And the judge, Judge Mitchell, sat sideways on the bench while Don Hollowell, his attorney and our attorney, presented his defense, totally ignoring anything that Attorney Hollowell had to say, flipping through, reading a comic book That's what the judge was doing on the stand. And when Hollowell had finished his defense, the judge said, "Are you finished?" 4 months, just like that. That's how that went down. I was there. I witnessed that with my own eyes.
Yes.
So when King was arrested on October 19th, it was in violation of his probated sentence. And that's when he was arrested in Fulton County. But DeKalb County asked Fulton to put a hold on him because they were going to take him into custody. And that's when he was sent down to Reedsville State Prison, the most notorious prison in the state and one of the most notorious in the Southeast.
Yes.
Because it was known as a place where guards would allow inmates to beat each other or kill each other with impunity. And they themselves would beat up on prisoners. So it was a bad place. And King was taken down in the middle of the night, like 3:30 or so in the morning, in a paddy wagon with a loose German Shepherd dog in the back with him. And he subsequently said that's the most afraid he'd ever been in his life. Well, he knew the reputation of Reedsville, as did all of the rest of us. So we knew that was a terrible situation for him. So that when the Kennedys intervened, we could talk about that in a minute. It was a matter of life and death as far as we were concerned, and King felt so as well.
Yeah, it's just chilling, this account, but I just want to make sure that people are tracking with us. He gets arrested on October the 19th. That's day one of the day 9 that is tracked in this book by the Kendricks.
Right.
He is with Lonnie King. He's brought to the Fulton County Jail. Charles, I understand you also went to jail that day, although you went to the other jail, the city jail. Fulton County was a brand spanking new jail at that point.
Right.
They were getting, it was national news, and the students made sure that the cameras were there when he was arrested, not brought out in handcuffs, not put into a paddy wagon, but driven in a sheriff's car or a police officer's car.
Captain Little,
held at Fulton County, was going to be released with all of the other students, some 200 students, but they held him back because of this outstanding warrant in DeKalb County. Right. Judge Mitchell made sure that warrant was effected. I just want to pause here because Stephen and Paul found from Donald Hollowell's papers, the defense lawyer, the transcript of the trial, which just it's tense, even though you know what's going to happen on some level at the end. Very tense. Astounding to read some of the transcription. I'm just wondering, Stephen, Paul, if you have any thoughts on finding that trial transcript, because it hadn't been produced anywhere else, and what you saw happening in this trial.
Oh, you take it.
Well, Donald Hollowell's papers had recently been opened at Sweet Auburn Library, and it's in old kind of beat up paper copies was copies of the trial. And you really see Hollowell's genius and the fearlessness that Lonnie had described to us about Donald Hollowell. And one reason we wrote the book was because, and Virginia, you talked about this at the start, to the extent people knew the story, they had just focused on the Kennedys. And that did get us interested in the story because, the Kennedy-Nixon race, but then just this richer story of the Atlanta student movement of you listen to Reverend Moss talk about what it was like to be around Lonnie. Well, we got to have that experience. And so we understood how he was able to build a movement because we really loved him. And then him connecting us with incredible people like Mr. Black and Reverend Moss. And so we had the sense that this was a story with characters that needed to be centered in it, and Donald Hollowell was one of them. And so having that trial to really be able to add to this story of that moment, and knowing the fear that Coretta had and the Daddy King had, and all the students like the two who are with us today who loved King, knowing that he was being sent into that dangerous place. But certainly when you read the transcript, you come away with the admiration that the students had for their lawyer, and Hollowell cared about them, but he was just so strong, commanded the courtroom, and you can see him putting segregation on trial, even though ultimately Judge Mitchell didn't want to hear it at that point.
Mm-hmm. So Charles also mentioned that this was just a couple of weeks before this really razor-thin national election. Vice President Richard Nixon running against Jack Kennedy, and they were trading off in the polls day by day by day. There was no room for any kind of mistake. So there was a lot at play here, and I'm wondering if you can talk with us a little bit about that, Stephen or Paul or Charles or Reverend Moss, the dynamics of the national race affecting the ground level politicians here in Georgia. You know, they're getting letters, telegrams, national media pressuring them to let a Black civil rights leader out of jail. And I just have to mention this. We have a question here from Jane Kidd, who is the daughter of Governor S. Ernest Vandiver. He was governor of Georgia from 1950 to 1963. Asked about whether the book tells the real story about the call from JFK to my father regarding King's incarceration as told to Jack Bass and recounted by Clifford Kuhn.
It
The
does.
answer is yes.
So Jane, thank you so much for writing to us. This is a big part here that, of course, Democratic politicians like Vandiver, like Mayor Hartsfield of Atlanta, and actually Judge Mitchell, you know, they were on the Kennedy side at that point. Nixon had been the party of, like the Republicans, the party of Lincoln. He was the preferred candidate by Daddy King, Martin Luther King Sr., for example, and most of the elders. So talk to us a little bit. I don't know who wants to pick this up, but how this maneuvering went on, and specifically the conversations between Vandiver and Jack Kennedy.
Well, I wanted to answer that question, but let's also take a step back beyond that. Yes, it was a razor close election, and neither candidate really wanted to talk about race. That was the last thing they wanted to do. And so for King to be arrested was the classic October surprise. And students understood that, and King at some level understood that, but at another level, he made clear all along that he was there to support the students. And he looked to Lonnie King and to others as the leaders. He made it clear to reporters and to historians later that he was there to support them. He was a mentor, and in that sense, someone to sort of inspire their efforts. They saw the surging energy of the Southern sit-in movement. And when we're living in the era of Black Lives Matter, it's important for us to remember that these are really young people we're talking about. King himself is only 31 years old. And so King is supporting even younger people who are taking this incredible energy that's surging across the South. And he wants to support them. And so, yes, of course, he's arrested at Riches. And he finds himself in this perilous situation. The Kennedy campaign, this is a mindset that's very difficult for us to really deal with. But at that point, the Black vote was up for grabs. Mm-hmm. And by no means was Kennedy assured of it. In fact, he was looked at with some suspicion. And Nixon,
he had voted against. He had voted against the '57 Civil Rights Bill, so he was even looked at with.
And Nixon put a lot of time and effort to befriend King, and certainly Daddy King endorsed Nixon the day before his son's arrest at Riches, and so by no means was this a slam dunk, mm-hmm. and yet Nixon was silent. His Black advisors couldn't seem to reach him. They couldn't seem to motivate him. Really, this story is about the modern world that we've inherited, because it is there that Nixon begins the insidious creation of the Southern strategy, the appeal to white Southern voters to be the bulwark of the Republican Party. But it's also here that really Black voters begin to sense that it is with the Democratic Party that they would be well advised to begin to give their hearts and energy to. And it begins really with the Kennedys reaching out. And
let me put a pin in that for just a second to ask another question. We'll get to the Vandiver question, but Michael asks, King was labeled a martyr that day in Decatur, a victim of racist Southern justice. But didn't he know that he could face prison if he joined the sit-in and violated his parole on the traffic ticket? To what extent was this King strategy all along providing way for him to put the justice system on trial in the court of public opinion?
It was. Go ahead.
You know, King testified under oath that day that he didn't understand he was on probation. And so, you know, and then in his JFK Library interview also said those things. So we take him at his word on that, but clearly he knew that there were great dangers in getting arrested. We sometimes forget how radical that notion was, to put yourself into a Southern jail in 1960. And so the students were forcing politicians to talk about civil rights for King to be arrested. And so I think he was very wary, but did not expect Mitchell to do exactly what he did.
Mm-hmm. Paul, do you want to pick up on that question about the phone calls, the conversations between Vandiver and Jack Kennedy, or the Kennedy campaign?
Well, I want to say there was a lot that happened behind the scenes between the Kennedys and the Georgia Democrats, and that's part of the story we wanted to tell here, and that. What leads to Bobby calling Judge Mitchell is really a story about the Georgia Democratic Party that I don't want to give too much away in the book, but showed there was a lot more than just the moral interest going on, but a political interest of the Democratic Party to get this problem solved. But the students forced the situation out in the open with the arrests, and then this interracial team on the Kennedy campaign, Louis Martin, Harris Wofford, and Sergeant Shriver, getting the Kennedy campaign involved, created that situation. And then you learn how the back channels of how John and Bobby work with Vandiver and some other characters, including Mitchell, to get King out.
Mm-hmm. They absolutely go rogue, in fact, in order to achieve their ends. And there's so many different machinations here that we can't go through. And I will leave that to readers of the book, because it really is so interesting about how to get things done, and questioning let's say, the real commitment to civil rights of the Kennedys. How would you describe that? Anyone want to pick that up? How the Kennedys really felt their commitment to it seems that they thought of civil rights as more of a problem to be handled rather than a real moral commitment at that point.
Let me say that years later, in a conference with the Martin Luther King Jr. Center under the leadership of Mrs. Coretta Scott King, Senator Edward Kennedy, Teddy Kennedy, was a keynote speaker. And he made a statement in his address that I have never forgotten, cannot, and I think the audience might have missed the impact of that. He said, Dr. King educated my family in the area of civil and human rights. I hope that somewhere in the King papers, that speech might be recorded. But I thought that to make that kind of statement publicly was, to me, historic and memorable.
Well, of course, there was, they had known, I think it's pointed out in the book, and this is something we know about the Kennedys. They grew up in Massachusetts. There wasn't a lot of interaction with African Americans at the time, and they experienced tremendous prejudice against them as Catholics. Lawrence asks, one of the most intriguing ironies in the book is Daddy King's aversion to Kennedy as a Catholic. Right. This doesn't seem to be a tolerant stance. I'm wondering if the panelists can discuss that. A great point. Even though Kennedy extended himself and did a great service during the time that Martin Luther King was in Reidsville, I think at that point, he said, I didn't want to vote for him.
You have to remember, Martin Luther King was named after Martin Luther. His name wasn't originally Martin Luther, it was Michael. Okay? Martin Luther was a big Protestant who took on the Catholic Church. So Kennedy, Daddy King had said that he wasn't sure he could vote for a Catholic for president. And it was only after this action by the Kennedys that he indicated that he would. The events of the 19th are important to recognize that we were not so much aware or thinking about the previous arrests, in DeKalb County. The motivation was to get King arrested, to bring more attention to our movement and to also influence the national presidential election, but with not much regard to the fact that there was this other thing hanging over his head. So when he violated his probation or his parole, whatever it was, probation, and was arrested and then taken there, it was something of a shock to a lot of us. But Lonnie King convinced Martin to go and be arrested after he protested that he didn't want to do that by quoting Daddy King, a line from Daddy King's sermon. It said, "You can't lead from the back."
Mm-hmm.
And so he was able to persuade ML to go and take this action. Now, as Dr. Otis had indicated, Lonnie had known King since he was 8 years old. Since Lonnie was 8 years old, he'd been a member of his church, and they knew each other as ML and the LC, Lonnie Cecil King, so that he was able to talk to him as a friend about these matters, and also to persuade him based on familiarity and also principle. And so those things made a big difference there. Let me mention one other thing about Lonnie King too. It's important to realize when we talk about a nonviolent struggle, we aren't talking about folk who are fearful. Lonnie King was an outstanding running back at Morehouse College on the football team when he was there. But he also, when he was in the Navy, he was a championship boxer, a whole fleet. He was a fleet champion in boxing, you know, and I've been with him when he had many opportunities to knock somebody out and didn't do that. On one occasion, we were picketing in West End and the guy threw acid in his face. I was directly behind him and felt the fumes from the acid. And Lonnie did not retaliate, although this guy was smaller and Lonnie could have knocked him into next day with a single punch, without a doubt. But that's the kind of guy he was. He also said that he was born looking up at the bottom. His bedroom was a pantry in his house where he lay on a cot, and the house was behind a fish market. So the reason he went into the service, as Otis indicated, well, his mother was working 2 and 3 jobs to put him through college, and he thought that was just not fair to her, and he dropped out of college to go into the Navy so she wouldn't have to do that. And then when he came back, of course, he was older than the average student on campus because he had spent the time in the Navy. Just wanted to throw that in.
I want to go back to a couple.
Virginia, can I?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. No, I just wanted to say that one, of course, you have to be careful what sermons you listen to. When Lonnie quoted Daddy King, "You can't lead from the back," that was a tough retort. One of the pleasures of writing this book is, of course, a day like today, and being able to sit in Lonnie King's living room and hear him tell his story. One of the sadnesses is that we were not able to share the book with him, and we wish we could. So he is with us, I think, today. And there's another figure that we missed today, and that's Harris Wofford, who, in a sense, helped begin the book for us. He was a friend of a neighbor of ours, and we got to spend probably 8 or 10 hours interviewing Harris, who really was for the key link between Dr. King and JFK. And that's sort of the seed, the original seed of the book. And Harris died at the age of 92 on Martin Luther King Day 2 years ago. So we were not able to give the book to him either. But when we think about the book, we think about Lonnie and we think about Harris. And we want to pay them due honor today on Martin Luther King Day, for sure.
Yes.
Sorry, go ahead.
Just agreeing.
Yeah.
Totally. I would like to also say that the enthusiasm, courage, and risk that the students were willing to take that's truly phenomenal. But we were asking through Lonnie, Dr. King to make a tremendous sacrifice. One, he was married. Mrs. King was pregnant. He was a co-pastor of Ebenezer and president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. But on top of that, he had an invitation from the president of the newly independent state of Nigeria that he was preparing to answer. He later did. But with all of those pressing responsibilities, commitments, we were asking him to make a sacrifice that no other student was making, because no other student carried that kind of total responsibility. And Dr. King said yes. After some in-depth discussion, he said yes. And when he said yes, he went all the way.
Well, I think that's an interesting thing that comes up in the book. This is a critical point in his life. He's 31 years old. He's been at this for what, 12, 13
About
years
8 years.
in this movement. And
Since 56, 55.
so he was, you know, he made a huge impact in his 20s. Now he's looking at his 30s. Where does the movement go from here? Where does he go from here? So I think it'd be really interesting to hear your viewpoints on where he was in his life and the kind of decisions that he was making then, and the impact of this absolutely terrifying. If you look at, you know, being jammed up in a Georgia court on a traffic violation, I mean, technically probation, but brought to Reidsville State Prison, where people just disappeared or fell off the map in the middle of the night with a German Shepherd, as you said, right next to him, Charles, where he was in his life and how he thought about this place he was in his life, with his wife pregnant at home and he can't see her, powerless.
Yes, and there is a brief letter that I consider one of the most prophetic statements of Dr. King's whole career, a personal handwritten letter while in Reidsville State Prison.
Mm-hmm.
And I constantly appeal to people to read that letter. He starts out the letter with the salutation to Mrs. King, "Hello, darling."
Mm.
And then he talks about the conditions under which he is imprisoned. And there is a line which says, "I have the faith to believe that the suffering coming to our family now will somehow serve to make Atlanta a better city, Georgia a better state, and America a better nation." Just how, I do not yet know, but I have the faith to believe that it will.
It reminds me of a quote from a king. He said that unearned suffering is redemptive.
Right.
Mm.
And then further into the letter, anticipating his stay in prison and not his immediate release, he gives Mrs. King a list of things to bring him when she makes the visit the following Sunday. I think it was the following Sunday. He was anticipating a visit. And he said to her, "Bring the following books: volumes 1 and 2 of Paul Tillich's theology, E. Stanley Jones' writing on Gandhi," and he gives the title, and he tells her to bring 18 of his sermons. And then he tells her to look on his desk and bring a book titled How to Increase Your Word Power, and describes the book. He tells her to bring a Bible and a radio. A revelation of how he was planning to spend those persecuting days in prison. And that's not all that he says in the letter, but to me, that letter is sacred literature. And if we were to reopen the canon, I would recommend that that be included with Philippians and some other books. That is my both emotional and intellectual feeling toward this whole experience. There are so many things that this book gives to us that will become a classic. It belongs in our homes, in our libraries, in our classrooms, and everywhere people have minds to know and to grow.
You know, it's important to note, based on that letter that Otis just referenced, that King was preparing to be there for 4 months.
Right.
You know, he had no idea he was going to be out after 9 days. He was sentenced to 4 months. And that's how he was preparing for his stay.
Right. And we
This
know,
book, by the way, is going to win a Pulitzer Prize, and it's going to be in every college library and be taught in every major classroom in college and high school, because it is a seminal document, extremely scholarly and thoroughly done. It would be hard to find a book more scholarly and just excellent.
well, another thing that they discovered, the authors who are with us here today, Paul and Stephen, a lot of incriminating evidence about Reidsville Prison. I mean, this was a very terrifying place.
Yes. Yeah.
And actually, Laura asked, thanks for the fascinating presentation. Were there any African-American employees at the prison or African-Americans in Southeast Georgia who could help pass communications about his condition? You did find that there are a group of incarcerated people at Reidsville who got out information about the terrible treatment there. I think it was printed in the Atlanta Journal or the Constitution. I can't remember
that very same week, actually.
Oh, really? That week?
Right. Yeah, that had gotten smuggled out. So yeah, we found, lawsuits against Reidsville and these pleas and cases in the newspaper about killings. So, but Mr. Black, Mr. Moss, they knew all this. Coretta King knew all this. Daddy King knew all this. So, we wanted to put that into the historical record, but this was known by those who loved King. And I just want to get one point in based on a really good question, is just paying tribute to the women in the movement. And we really wanted to make sure that we did that. In the book, no school was better represented by Spelman. There were very traumatic things that happened to these brave women who went to prison and went to jail, to the city prison farm. And so they had been central to the movement from the start, Rosalind Pope writing the appeal. And so I just wanted to make sure, that we called out that history. And I also wanted to, it's just a profound thanks, to Mr. Black, to Reverend Moss. We could not have told this book without the help of those that were there. It would not read as it does, we treasure our time listening to them and learning from them. And so, I just wanted to get that in of just how grateful we are to them and their heroism.
Well, Mr. Black, given your endorsement of the book, we do also have a question here. Are the movie rights to the book available, and will the Kendricks accept a check?
I don't know. We just hope people read it. We just want to share the story as much as we can, because again, the students forced this to happen, to make sure people could not turn away from civil rights inequalities, that they would have to confront racial equality that couldn't get put on the back burner. They made the nation focus in on that. And, I think Dr. King Day is not here to comfort us. Dr. King Day is to challenge us. And so, what can we be doing to be bolder in our own lives? And someone mentioned, in the Q&A about those lessons. And, certainly, Lonnie just called it a meeting, just getting started, and Mr. Black and Mr. Moth, jumping in, the women of Spelman, and of the other Atlanta University schools, all just being brave. And we can't all be Dr. King, but we can all be, there's more we can all do that it might be uncomfortable to us, that might be outside of our comfort zones, but to speak out against things that are wrong and to speak for things that are right. And that is certainly something that we learned in telling this story from these incredible, courageous heroes.
Well, that is a beautiful place to bring in a student activist. This book points out that although a lot of credit goes to the Kennedys for getting King freed, it was the efforts of Louis Martin, Donald Hollowell, Harris Wofford, Sergeant Shriver, and the groundwork laid by the Atlanta student movement. So I'd love to welcome into the conversation one person who is keeping that flame alive, Genesis Hendricks. She's an 18-year-old senior at Decatur High School, which is in DeKalb County, where that trial or those procedures took place. Genesis is among those who advocated to remove a Confederate monument in Decatur Square this summer. And she and fellow student Daxton Pettis are two of the prime movers who got the city to agree to install a plaque commemorating Dr. King's sentencing by Judge Mitchell in October of 1960. Genesis, hello and welcome.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Well, thanks for being here. And the marker is due to be mounted in March of this year, although there may be some delays. So why for you so important that people know what happened to Dr. King in your hometown?
Well, this story was pretty much untold. It happened right in my community of Decatur City. The DeKalb building in which Dr. King was sentenced happened right behind my school, actually. And so for the longest time, I had no idea that this had occurred. I had never learned about it in school. And so when I was approached about the story and I learned more and I did research about the story and everything around that, I thought, yes, we need to place a marker to tell the events that basically impacted the election and into what we know as present day. So.
Well, and you and Daxton helped organize an assembly at your school with Charles Black, who's with us today, Dr. Rosalind Pope mentioned earlier, and others who invited members of the city commission to hear about this history and advocate for a marker. Now, apropos of what Paul was just talking about, what made you think you could or should make this happen?
I think it was the power of the youth, the amount of student support that I got and that both Dax and I received as organizers was very, very admirable and motivating. And when we got the support of the city, the school, and the community as a whole, we felt that we could push this story out, that people were ready to listen to the history that Decatur played a part in. And yeah, we thought that was essential.
So Decatur is now considered a liberal stronghold, very different city than it was in the 1960s.
Yes.
As a result of the protests following George Floyd's murder last summer, the city agreed to remove this Confederate monument. And we know now more African Americans voted in the Georgia general and runoff elections than ever before. So where do you think the activism is now? Where do you have to go now? Where is the work to be done?
I believe it is in small group conversations. Yes, we may have dismantled de jure policies that have discriminated against people, but there are still structures of white supremacy and other forms of discrimination within our mindsets, within our school systems and workplaces and places that we encounter every single day. So I think it's having those difficult conversations that were never really had until recently, where we can come to an understanding and inform each other of our experiences and our differences.
I'm a big fan of Genesis. I just want the record to show. I was very much impressed with her activism and her intellect and her leadership capacity at her school there. And I told her that I'm going to be just like her when I grow up.
And I want to join in this tremendous salute to this outstanding student. You say to us that our struggles are not in vain, that the next generation will be doing terrific things, and are doing, the next generation, members of that generation are doing great things here and now. Thank you.
Now, I want to pick up on Paul's observation about the women's involvement. You know, the women made our movement. You know,
Yes.
you count on guys to make speeches, you know, and pontificate and hold forth and all that sort of thing. But if there's work to get done, it's the women who are going to be there. Women were always there in larger numbers than the guys. Lonnie King's mother said to him when he was concerned about whether or not our movement would have, you know, enough support among students and all that. His mother suggested to him that he get the ladies from Spelman involved, and the guys from Morehouse would come. And of course, you know, guys from Morehouse would come. And that was a large part of it. But women were always a part of the leadership of our movement. You know, you had Marion Wright Edelman, you had, what's her name?
Ruby Doris.
Well, Ruby Doris Smith, Shalinar, I was trying to think of Herschel Shalinar, Carolyn Long Banks, a lot of women who made the difference in here. And so you see, you got Genesis here. But, you know, in today's movement, you know, the whole Black Lives Matter thing, women making that movement happen. And a good friend of mine, Ornike Olehi, was one of the leaders of the Mute Art Kelly movement. And that's significant. A lady that I admire extremely, Dr. Emiko Soltis, heads Freedom University. You know, I mentioned earlier that helps undocumented students get college education. So, you know, if you want something done, you know, get the women involved and let them lead. Get out of the way.
Well,
Genesis, yeah, I was just going to say that, yeah.
Go.
I'm sorry. But Genesis, you were talking about conversation and small group conversation. The historian Taylor Brandt says that the difference between 60 years ago and now is that then the prejudices were so overt and so offensive and so evident, and now they're subtle and quiet and insidious, and they're harder to root out. And that's true even if a week and a half ago we saw a Confederate flag in the middle of the Capitol of the United States. So maybe it's not so subtle after all. So, you know, there's a lot of heart opening that we have to do here. And it's not all about laws, and it's not all about justice. It's about realization of, are we going to have this country for everyone or not? And so the work that you all are doing is wonderful. And that youth energy is exactly what the book is about in the end. It's not about what happened 61 years ago. It's about what can happen now, because there are people that have showed us a way and a path and a process. And this is our work too. And boy, having you part of this, Genesis, is so great.
Well, thank you. And I just wanted to point out that I'm so honored to be on a panel and to meet so many civil rights leaders that got me to the place that I can be and empowered me to keep on fighting and keep on working so that the next generation after me and so on and forth can continue the good fight.
Genesis,
All right.
thank you
All right,
so
all
much
right.
for that. Really glad to have you with us.
Thank you so much.
Virginia, could we flash back for a moment to that election? You know, Kennedy won by only 100,000 votes. This was the first time that the networks were using computers to project the outcomes of elections. And CBS, I think it was, had projected that Nixon would win by 100 to 1, and that he would get 459 electoral votes or some such thing. Well, Kennedy won with 302 electoral votes. Now, the thing that made the difference when the Kennedys intervened to get King out of jail. This campaign published a document that was known as the Blue Bomb. Okay, it was on blue paper. And
There it is.
Okay, and it was distributed in all the major cities that had large Black populations. Again, all of this began 2 weeks before the election, and Nixon was leading by double digits, and Kennedy ended up winning.
And especially in Black churches.
Yes, and Kennedy ended up winning by less than 1 vote per precinct. It was that close. Now we're dealing with the election that just took place here, where one guy won by 7 million votes and 306 electoral votes, and there are folk in our Congress who are denying that the election took place. Thank you.
That blue bomb is just one of the great genius pieces of political machinations that Louis Martin, having his knowledge of the Black community, how to tell a story, was able to do without white voters really being any wiser, but to get the story out of what Kennedy did. But certainly it is hopeful to see the minister of Dr. King's church, of his pulpit, who people tried to fearmonger against the way they did when King moved home to Georgia, but folks at DeKalb and around Georgia really rejecting that, so that we can try to build on what happened in this hopeful moment for an equal multiracial democracy, and protect that from all the forces that are really trying to take that away.
Well, I'd love to follow up on that. Reverend Moss, Charles Black, here we are, 2021. The John Lewis's last public appearance was at the Black Lives Matter Plaza in Washington, D.C., which would have been unimaginable, of course, in 1960. And the minister from Ebenezer Baptist Church headed for the U.S. Senate. So at the same time, we have a Confederate flag paraded through the U.S. Capitol for the first time ever, from a breach from a violent white extremist. So you have both you've seen progress. You've seen backsliding. You watched it in real time. How do you keep up your will for the fight?
I just sent an article to the Atlanta Inquirer, which Charles Black was
Editor,
editor and a part of the founding team for it. And the title of the article is "The Great, the Horrible, and the Wonderful." And often when great things take place, alongside that greatness is the horrible. And ultimately, something wonderful comes to pass. The greatness of this moment in which we now live is to see a Warnock from Ebenezer, and Ossoff from the community, an African American and a Jewish American, an African American with the history of the Atlantic slave trade, a Jewish American with the history of the Holocaust, and yet they are both representing us in the United States Senate. That's great. By any standard of measurement, it is great. But in the midst of that, January 6th, we see the horrible, perpetrated really by the President of the United States. And as you mentioned earlier, for the first time in the history of our nation, somebody displaying a Confederate flag with an insurrection action taking place in the state capitol, and senators and congresspersons, including the vice president, have to run for their lives, all inspired by the President of the United States of America. That's horrible. But Wednesday of this week, something wonderful will take place. the inauguration of President-elect Biden and Vice President-elect Harris. That is wonderful. But between the great and the wonderful often falls the horrible. And we must never get consumed with the horrible, but we can never ignore it. But we must also constantly look at and lift up the great and the wonderful taking place in the face of the horrible. And that's exactly what we saw in October of 1960.
I think we've lost Charles for the moment, but I will put to you then, Otis Moss, you are the person who came and counseled students who had been arrested, Fulton County Jail. They thought they might be facing 18 months of charges. They didn't know they may not have known what they were in for, just bringing their toothbrushes with them and a couple of books. So how did you counsel them then? And how would you counsel people who are fighting the fight now, who were arrested for protesting the murder of George Floyd, for example, or somebody who is protesting for equal rights for trans people, or something like that? What would you say to them now? Is that the same sentiment?
I think we constantly have to lift up the great and the wonderful in the face of the horrible, and see the horrible that's taken place as a challenge, but it must not overwhelm us. It must not defeat us, because there is always present that which is great, and something wonderful is always in the making, even when we cannot see it. Charles mentioned earlier the leadership and the courage of the students, the female students, the women in the movement. For instance, one of the Spelman students in that county jail, sleeping on the top bunk of a double bunk bed arrangement, witnessed a deputy in the jail coming into their cell and raping the woman underneath her, and then went on about his business without any kind of consequences. So the dangers, the toils, and the snares faced in the movement, and constantly by the women in the movement, and the sexism within the movement, and yet they made the greatest contributions. There's a whole story about Fannie Lou Hamer and Anel Ponda in Mississippi. We do not have time to give the stories, but they must be told and retold. The sacrifices, the sufferings, and the leadership. Without the women of Montgomery in the African American community, there would have been no Montgomery movement. And we can repeat that over and over. Arkansas, Daisy Bates; Mississippi, Fannie Lou Hamer; Montgomery, Mrs. Robinson and Mrs. Rosa Parks. And throughout the movement, that has been the soul and backbone to keep it alive, working day and night, making all kinds of sacrifices. And these stories must be told and retold, I think, in a much wider sense. They are beginning to be told, but they must be told to our present generation and future generation in even a more dynamic way.
Well,
You
that's what
mentioned,
this
you
book
mentioned
is
Ruby Doris
about.
Smith earlier. She died at the age of 25.
Right.
She had some serious health issues and should have been in the hospital, but she chose to go to jail instead,
Correct.
as a part of her commitment to the movement. Now, that's something. 25 years old, and she sacrificed her life, really, for the cause.
Well, and ultimately, Martin Luther King, Dr. King sacrificed his life, and that's something we do have to wrap, certainly. But Stephen and Paul, I would love to have you comment on that as we close. That you spoke to Andrew Young, one of the few people that Dr. King ever talked about in those very dark hours, riding to Reidsville. Charles mentioned it earlier. He was more frightened than he'd ever been in his life, and in Reidsville. And Young feels like the experience may have brought out the best in John Kennedy, but it left scars on Martin Luther King Jr. that never healed. He also speculated he became comfortable then with the idea of his own death. How do you think that transformed him as a leader, and what did it mean for the movement going forward?
Yeah, well, it was also an honor to spend time with Ambassador Andrew Young during one of my trips to Atlanta, and this was something he felt very strongly based on the late night conversations that he had with Dr. King, and because the Reidsville ride was something Dr. King never joked about, but he had to go through facing down death if he was going to be able to fulfill his mission. He came to terms with that. Ambassador Young called it a dark night of the soul, as is told in the Christian tradition. But then from there, Dr. King could go on to Birmingham, where he would really change so many hearts and minds in America to be able to move the politicians like Kennedy to getting civil rights legislation moving. So I just want to make sure folks understand that Mr. Black, Reverend Moss, they changed Dr. King. They were inspired by Dr. King, and then they inspired Dr. King, and him having these experiences changed America, and gives us a legacy to keep building on. We've talked about the power of organizing. We know Genesis is doing it. There's much more to do, but I think for us on this day that we recognize the heroism of Martin Luther King, we hope folks will really dive into this story and more Atlanta student movement stories, because it helps you understand how the king that we celebrate, that we recognize, how he became that king, and the students were such a crucial part of making that happen. So we can't thank Mr. Black and Reverend Moss enough.
Thank you so much. And I want to note that a number of the people have commented, so proud of Genesis, so proud of this young lady. So Genesis, just please take that in. And also a lot of thanks for all of the comments. I'm sorry that I didn't get to all of your questions, but thanks for an enormously important, inspiring discussion. I'm grateful for your activism, your commitment, your devotion, and being in service together. And that goes for, I think, me and probably all of us as well. Charles Black, thank you so much for speaking with us today.
It's my pleasure. And remember the name Genesis Reddix. You'll be hearing that a lot.
We will see it on the
Daxton.
marquee or somewhere.
Yeah.
And the Reverend Dr. Otis Moss, a great pleasure to speak with you today. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Paul
Yes,
Kendrick.
Thank you for being such a thoughtful moderator, Virginia.
Well,
we
it is
really
my
appreciate your
pleasure.
passion for great stories and history. Thank you.
Thank you.
And the Atlanta
Paul,
History Center. Thank you.
Yes. And Reverend Stephen Kendrick and Genesis Reddix. 9 days, the race to save Martin Luther King Jr.'s life and win the 1960 election. We encourage you to purchase the book from your local bookseller. Our local bookseller is Acapella Books. You can purchase it using the chat button, the chat panel, on your screen, or you can go to the Atlanta History Center website or to Acapella Books directly. And we really want to thank you so much for tuning into this celebration of Dr. King. You can find educational resources for the whole family, as well as more information about Martin Luther King Jr., the Atlanta student movement, and more at atlantahistorycenter.com. This conversation is going to be posted on the History Center's website, and it's going to be featured on C-SPAN. You can take a look at other upcoming virtual author events at atlantahistorycenter.com. Thank you so much for speaking with us or being with us today. And also there's plenty of hours left to do some service in honor of Dr. King. Thank you so much for being with us today.
All right. Be blessed, everybody.
Thank you, Virginia.
Blessings.
Bye-bye.
Right.
Thank you so much. Let's take action, bold action.